Maseches Kesubos Daf Mem Tes contains two sugyas and contains one mishnah which divides the daf into two different sugyas. The first sugya is a continuation of the sugya we've been discussing on the last daf, and that is what happens when a woman is delivered into the rishus of her husband's messengers. To what extent is she transferred into his rishus and no longer in the father's rishus? And the mishnah will introduce to us the topic of a father supporting his daughter. When is he financially obligated to support her? The Gemara will discuss what age this obligation is, and what is the severity of this obligation. Is there an obligation at all? Is it a mitzvah or is it a chiyuv? Then the Gemara will introduce two of the first three takanos that were made in Usha, which we will be discussing in this sugya. So let's begin. We've been in the middle of discussing what happens when a father is delivering his daughter into marriage. So if he transfers her to the guardianship of the husband's messengers, so then to a certain extent she's already considered to have left the rishus of the father and she's now in the rishus of the husband. One of the ways in which we've seen that was very significant is that if she'll be mizana at this point, she will get the halacha of an eshes ish, not the halacha of an engaged woman. She was engaged until she reached the husband's messengers. From the time that she's given over to the messengers of the husband, now she is considered to be in his rishus. Now, there's a different onesh. As long as she's engaged, she would get skila once she's in husband's rishus, which we're saying is even when she's just transferred to the messenger's custody, even before chuppah, then it's already chenek. As Gemara asks, what happens if she were to go back? What happens if she never makes it all the way to the husband's rishus? What happens if she gets divorced or sent home, or if the husband dies before she ever gets to him? Does she now go back into the father's rishus, or does she remain independent because she was never really married? She never really had any sort of chuppah. So the Gemara says, this is clear in a Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael. Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, learn it out from a pasuk discussing Hafaras Nadarim. There it says, "V'neder almana grusha kol asher asa anaf sheyakam alau." An almana, a widow, or a grusha, a divorcee, who makes a neder, no one could be made for it. Not her husband and not her father. She doesn't have a husband, and her father, she's already left his rishus when she got married. So Gemara says, what is the chiddush of that? Obviously, she's not in the trust of the husband, she's not in the trust of the father. What is the pasuk trying to tell me? Obviously, the pasuk is referring to something which you would not have thought she's already out of the father's rishus. And that's our case. That's the case where she was transferred into the rishus of the husband's messengers, but she never actually got there. She never made it to chuppah. There, it's teaching me that even in that situation, she's already out of the father's rishus, and the husband, if she never gets married to him, she now has no one to be meher her nidar. Now the Gemara is going to bring two brises which support what we said, that from the time she's transferred to the husband's rishus, even without chuppah, she would get chenek if she was mizanet. So the first one is Rav Papa bringing a Mishnah. So the Mishnah says that the halacha that a nara marasa gets skila only applies to the following four conditions. First of all, she's nara, basula, marasa, and bevei savia. So she has to be a nara, meaning a nara, not a bagara. She can't be older than 12 and a half. She has to be a basula and not a baula. She has to be ma'ura, so she has to be engaged and not that she already had chuppah, even if she didn't have bia yet. Because we already said she has to be a basula. Even though she didn't have bia yet, she also can't be a balas chuppah. She can't have had nesun already. So what's that? What's the last halacha, bevei savia? What's that adding? So Mara says that's adding that she couldn't even have been transferred to the husband's shluchim. Once she's transferred to the husband's shluchim, then she already becomes she's considered to be bechenek. Okay, the Gemara now goes further. The Gemara brings its second proof to this, and this is from Nachman bar Yitzchak, who quotes another Mishnah. And it says that somebody, the husband, the person that's mizana with a eshes ish, gets the same punishment that she gets, and this one discusses his. So it says that somebody who is mizana with an eshes ish, once she's in rishus habal, he gets chenek. Now, it says rishus habal, does not say after chuppah, which shows that once there's a transference into the rishus, even though chuppah didn't happen, that is when the punishment of chenek is the rule of law, because, like we said, once transferred into the custodianship of the shluchim of the husband, then she's already considered to be in his rishus. Now we begin the Mishnah, which will introduce us to the topic of a father's obligation to support his children financially. So this, we're going to divide it up into the sons and the daughter. They have different chiyuvim, sons and the daughters. And we'll talk about during the life of the father and after the death of the father. Now, after the death of the father is simpler because that's written clearly in the Kesubah. When a man marries, he writes in his wife's Kesubah, I'm promising you a certain amount of money as a severance if this marriage ends and you're alive. What happens if she dies before the marriage ends? What happens to that money? So he writes as follows. The money for your daughters, my estate will be set aside to support them. They will be fed from my estate. That's written into the ksuba. As far as the sons, it's written as follows. The money that is supposed to go to your ksuba, were I to die first, that money is going to go to them, and it'll be exclusive to them. It won't be part of the inheritance that they'll share with the brothers from a different wife. It won't be regular inheritance. They will get your ksuba money, specific and unified for them. So these two halachas, says the Mishnah, go together. The father provides support for his daughters, and the daughters of the wife. He writes it into the ksuba, and he provides the ksuba money to her sons. Those two things only happen after the death of the father. However, while the father is alive, he has no obligation to support the daughter. The daughter only gets that support after the death, just like the sons only inherit the ksuba after his death. The daughter only gets support after his death. While he's alive, he has no financial obligation to support the daughters. That's what the Mishnah says. Now, the Gemara begins, and the Gemara says, first of all, what are you talking about, a daughter and not a son? It seems to imply that a father is obligated to support his son. The second thing that this implies is that there's no chiyuv to support the daughters, but there is a mitzvah to support the daughters. So we're making two diukim here. We're saying that the halacha, this Mishnah seems to be holding the following halacha. It holds that for a son, there are three potential levels. There could be a chiyuv, an obligation to support. There could be no chiyuv, but a mitzvah to support, or there could be none of them. Zero. So the Gemara says the implication is that what it says clearly is that the daughter have no obligation. So the implication is that there is an obligation for the son. There is an obligation to support. For the daughter, there is a mitzvah to support. So who holds that way? So the Gemara is going to show three tanaim and show that this does not fit with any of them. And then the Gemara is going to answer that they actually do fit with all of them. You just have to adjust your diukim. You didn't make your diukim correctly. Now, what are the three tanaim that we have? So we have Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Huda, and Rabbi Yechanan ben Broika. What are their opinions? So their opinions are as follows. Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda both agree to the halacha. They just disagree as to which one is more obvious. They both hold that there is a mitzvah to support the sons and the daughters during the lifetime of the father, no chiyuv. So that's not going to fit with our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said that it implied, according to our diak, that there is a chiyuv to fit with there is a chiyuv to support the sons. So the Gemara says, so it can't be either of those. Who's the third one? The third one is Rabbi Yechanan ben Broika. He says there is only a chiyuv to support sons after the death and daughters after the death. While the father is alive, he has zero chiyuv to support not the sons and not the daughters, and zero mitzvah to support not the sons and not the daughters. So that certainly doesn't fit with our Mishnah, which we said implies that there's a chiyuv to support the sons and a mitzvah to support the daughters. Now, what was the difference between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda? So the difference between them was which one is more obvious. According to Rabbi Meir, it's more obvious that there's a mitzvah to support sons than daughters, because the sons need to sit and learn, so you support them so they should be able to sit and learn. According to Rabbi Huda, it's more obvious that you need to support the daughter, because the daughter would be degrading for her to go collecting and support herself. So it's more, if you have to support the son, there's a mitzvah that is to support the son, and certainly is a mitzvah to support the daughters. So the Gemara says the Brisa really fits with all three opinions. Could be any of them, and you just made your diukim wrong. How so? So it's as follows. Rabbi Meir would say that really there's a mitzvah to support both the sons and the daughters. There's no chiyuv. Why did the Mishnah only say that there is a mitzvah, only imply that there is a mitzvah to support the daughters, which implies that there's a chiyuv to support the son? The answer is because there's really only a mitzvah to both. But the Mishnah wanted to say that there's a mitzvah to support the daughters to teach you that there's at least a mitzvah to support the daughters. Since the son is more obvious that he requires support because he's learning Torah, so you gotta, if I would have only said that there's a mitzvah for the son to be supported, you would have thought, oh, the daughter's less, so maybe the daughter doesn't even have a mitzvah. So we want to say, even the daughters have a mitzvah to be supported, not only the son that it's obvious has a mitzvah to be supported. That's how you would read the Mishnah according to Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Huda, it's the opposite. Because according to him, the daughter is one level higher than the son because it's degrading for her to collect. Therefore, had I said that there was a mitzvah to support the son, I would have think that to support the daughters is a chiyuv, is a level higher. So therefore, it has to say that no, there's only a mitzvah. That's why it focuses on the fact that there's a mitzvah to support the daughter. Now, according to Rabbi Yechanan ben Broika, he made a wrong diak altogether. The Mishnah, when it said that there's no obligation to support. It didn't mean to say there's no obligation, but there is a mitzvah. It meant to say there's no obligation and there's no mitzvah. You'll ask, why did it say there's no obligation? It should say even more, it should say that there's no mitzvah. The answer is because it's comparing it to after the death of the father. After the death of the father, we said there is an obligation. So it says, after the death there's an obligation, before the death there's no obligation. That's why we're talking about obligations. But mitzvah, there certainly isn't either, and we could have just as easily said there's no mitzvah. The Gemara now introduces 2 of 3 takanas that were made in Usha when Sanhedrin left the Lishkas Hagazas in the Beis HaMikdash. They were sent to 11 different places, one after another. One of them was Usha. So while they were in Usha, they set up 3 takanas. So takana number 1 says the Gemara that Rabbi Allah quotes Rish Lakish, the name of Rabbi Yehuda, who in the name of Yehuda Bar Chanina, who says that the first takana is that a person has to support, he has to feed and provide financial support to his children. Now, that is not an obligation, but it is a takanas usha. Now, the Mefarshim say that up to age 6, there is an obligation. There's no dispute. There's definitely an obligation to support the children up to age 6. The question is, from age 6, and in the times of Chazal, they were able to support themselves, is the father financially obligated to continue supporting them or not? He wasn't obligated deraisa, but the Gemara says in Usha they were metaking that he is obligated. Now the Gemara asks, is this the halacha? Is this true? So the Gemara says it's not true. There is no obligation. The Chachamim very much try to force somebody, try to do everything they could to convince a person to support his children. However, they did not have the power to force him, because the halacha was that he's not forcible. There is no takanas usha. And we have 3 examples of how Chachamim used to deal with people who refused to support their kids. And we see from the fact that they couldn't just force them that this takana is not correct. So what are the 3 ways that they used to handle it? So the Gemara says, number 1 is Rav Yehuda. He used to say to them, a ya'arod, which Rashi calls a tanin, a lizard. It gives birth, and it just throws them to the people of the city to support them. That's what you are. You're giving birth to kids, and you're not interested in taking care of them. You just wanted Tzibur to deal with them. Now, when they came to Rav Chizda, he would say to them, turn over a big container, grinder, pestle, and stand on it and make an announcement and say, the ravens want their children, and I don't want my kids, because I just throw them in the street. So Gemara interrupts. Gemara says, hold on, the ravens don't want their kids. We have a pasuk which we say all the time in Tehillim, Livnei Oyer v'Asher Yikro. Hashem provides support to the children of the ravens, because the parents don't. So Gemara says, no, there is a point at which they don't, and there's a point at which they do. The life cycle of the raven is that when it's born, it's white, and therefore the parents don't recognize it as being their son, their child, because they're black. However, once they turn black, then the parents recognize them and show them love and do support them and do feed them. So you're worse than the ravens, because at least them, when they recognize the kid, they support him. Now, what Rav used to do is he would say, what do you want? You want that the entire town should have to give tzedakah to your kids to feed them? That's not the right thing to do. Now, the Gemara points out that although the halach is that they don't have to support them, if they're rich, we do force them. And the reason is because a rich person, if he is rich, we do force him. The reason is because a rich person can be forced to give tzedakah. Whenever there's a communal need, he can be forced to give that. So these kids are going to have to be supported from tzedakah anyway, so we could force him b'toras tzedakah, not b'toras being the parent, but b'toras tzedakah, we could force him to be to actually financially support the child. Now, the Gemara goes further, and the Gemara quotes the second takana of Usha, said by Rabbi Allah, named Rav Rish Lakish. And this is talking about a situation where somebody writes off, it's an unrelated subject, it was where somebody writes a shtar that he's transferring possession of all his property to his children. And that is that he said, he obviously wanted to give over his inheritance while he was alive, so he wrote a shtar, he said, I'm giving everything I own to my kids. So the takana was that the children, although they now own all the property, are obligated to financially support the man and his wife. Although they're the kids are now the inheritors, they now own it, but they still have to feed them. So the Gemara asks, what's the chiddush of this? It would seem to be obvious because we could see this halacha based on a different halacha. What's that halacha? The halacha is that the almana herself, even after her husband has died, has the right to be fully supported from the property of herself and her husband. Now, if the almana gets support, so when the husband is alive together with her and they've just given over the inheritance already, they would certainly get support. It would seem to be obvious. So before the Gemara answers it, the Gemara goes through a discussion as to how we see that they're obligated to support, adding some halachos. So the Gemara says a widow has a right to support from the inheritance of her husband. Now, the Gemara talks about a letter that was written by Ravin in which he wrote out these halachas. And he wrote, the case he was speaking about where there were no sons. So the inheritance went to a daughter. So the inheritance has to be used to support the mother, to support the wife of the father who died before the daughter can use it. They have to set aside money for the widow's support. Now, what happens if that daughter goes and gets married? So the halacha over there is when a woman gets married, her husband takes control of her property. Obviously, he has to give it back to her if the marriage ends, but he has rights over her property at that time. In exchange, he supports her, but he has control of her nechasim, which includes the inheritance. Now, generally, Chazal made a special takana for the husband that he has the status of a buyer, of a lakoach. Now, a lakoach has a right to take the property away from the inheritor. The lakoach gets precedence over the inheritors. If the inheritor needs some of the property to take his inheritance, the buyer doesn't have to give it up. Somebody who bought it doesn't have to give it up. He can't collect from the chasim mishubadim. The inheritor doesn't take the chasim mishubadim. And generally, Chazal gave that privilege to the husband who takes the property of the wife. He's considered to be a buyer from the wife, and therefore, if the property that the wife had is meshubid, or once it's meshubid to him, no one can collect that property and take it away from the husband. He's a buyer, unless it's someone who has the right to take away from a buyer. Now, the mother, the almana, who's wanting to collect, her chiv support should not be able to take away from the buyer, should not be able to take away from the husband of the daughter who has the halacha of a buyer, and therefore that property is considered to be meshubed to him. She can't collect from mishubadim. So Gemara says, but here it's different. As far as this halacha is concerned, he doesn't have the halacha of a buyer. Generally, as the halacha of a buyer, as far as this case, he does not have the halacha of a buyer. And the reasons are explained later in the Masechta. The takana was made in a case where he spent money in order to get the property. Here he didn't spend any money, so he has nothing to lose. We're not worried that he's going to not want to do it anymore. The reasons for making him a buyer don't count. Now, okay, so therefore, the mother has a right to be supported from the property that goes to the daughter. If the daughter is married, she has a right to be supported from the property, even if there's a husband, still she has kedima. Now, if the daughter dies, and now the husband fully inherits the property, inherits his wife, still his mother-in-law gets support from that property, because that property is pledged to support the wife of the deceased father, and therefore she still gets support from that. So this is the Gemara's proof from this letter. The Gemara quotes a case where that last case happened. It is the Rabbi Yehuda, the son of the sister of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, said that this case happened to me, and I saw this. This is the halacha. Either way, that's the halacha, and therefore the Gemara's kasha is that if the wife, when she's the only one alive, has to get supported from the inheritance, the wife and the husband together should certainly have to get supported from the inheritance. They're trying to point out the question is not fully accurate, because in this case it's not an inheritance. They wanted to give an early inheritance, but it's still not the halach of an inheritance. It's the halach of a gift, so they knowingly gave it over. So it's not quite the same as if they inherited. But the Gemara is viewing it as an inheritance at this point. So we will leave it at that for the purposes of this discussion. So the Gemara's answer is that here it's a bigger chiddush to say that the husband and his wife still get financial support from this inheritance that they gave over to their children. And that's because the husband's here. So he could, officially, he could go out and work. Now, if it's just the wife, so we assume she's not obligated to work, and we don't put the obligation to work on her. So her husband's not around, so she has to be supported from the property. However, in our case, the husband and the wife are both around. So you may say that the husband, okay, let him go work. Let him, if he wrote over all his property to his kids, let him go get a job and support himself and his wife. And therefore, it's an extra chiddush to say that, and this was a takana that they made in Usha, extra chiddush to say that they do get to collect support from the money that they gave over to their sons. Now, the Gemara asks, is this halacha or not? Is this correct? So the Gemara says that it is correct. The Gemara brings a proof, because it was a situation that happened where Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yonasan were sitting together, and somebody came and he kissed Rabbi Yonasan on his foot. And Rabbi Chanina said, what was that all about? And he said, that was a kaiser nechasa of Lebanov, and I made his children support him and collect from him. Now, so the Gemara says, actually, this shows that this was not the halacha, because he couldn't force them. If the halacha was that this that we're saying that the Usha Takana was really accepted halachically, what's this tremendous gratitude he has to Rabbi Yonasan? All Rabbi Yonasan did was enforce a halacha that it was clearly set up in Usha. So the chiddush is, so we see from here that this was not the halacha. He was not obligated to be supported, but Rabbi Yonasan went ahead and collected support from him as a display of gratitude. He came and he kissed him on his foot.